When I first entered the old barn on my grandparents' farm, a strange feeling came over me. The floorboards creaked under my feet, and the dust floating in the air seemed untouched for a lifetime. The barn was deserted, as if no one had entered it for decades, and yet it felt as if someone was watching me. The barn stood at the edge of the cornfield, and although it looked harmless during the day, at night it was a place I wanted to avoid at all costs. I had often heard stories about this barn, stories I thought were fairy tales to keep us children away from the dangerous equipment and tools. But now, as an adult, I felt an inexplicable pull to this place. As I entered that day, I noticed something strange. A barely audible whisper filled the air, so faint that I wasn't sure if I was imagining it. It seemed to come from the walls, from the wood itself, which carried the stories of times past within it. I shivered as if a cold breath touched me and left the barn as quickly as I could. In the following days, I couldn't forget the whispering. It haunted me even in my dreams, a soft rustling that stole my peace. At night I lay awake, listening to see if the sound from the barn reached my room, but the rustling remained distant, as if it existed only in my mind. One evening, as I tried to calm my thoughts, I heard it again. It sounded like the rustling of corn in the wind, but more intense, as if it were a language I didn't understand. I was obsessed, unable to resist, so I put on a jacket and went outside. The moon shone brightly over the cornfield, and the barn cast a long shadow on the ground. The closer I came, the clearer the rustling became. It definitely came from the barn, and this time I was determined to find out what it was. With trembling hands, I opened the old door. The rustling grew louder, filling my ears, and then a deep, cutting cold permeated me. It was as if the rustling flowed through me like water through a sieve. That night I stayed in the barn for a long time. I don't know what kept me there. Perhaps it was the desire to solve the mystery or the uncanny fascination emanating from this place. The rustling gradually transformed into voices. They whispered, murmured words I didn't understand. It was as if dozens of people were speaking at once, and yet I couldn't make out any individual words. I tried to speak to them, called into the darkness, but the whispering only grew louder. It sounded more urgent, as if they wanted to tell me something important, but the more I tried, the more their meaning eluded me. It was as if a veil lay between me and the voices, a veil of shadows and forgetting. Then suddenly the whispering stopped. It was as if someone had flipped a switch, and the silence that followed was deafening. I stood frozen, my heart pounding wildly in my chest. Something was wrong, I knew it. The voices were gone, but the impression of their presence remained. I felt watched, and an undefined dread seized me. As I left the barn, my gaze fell on the cornfield. In the moonlight, it looked like an endless ocean of silver, gently swaying in the wind. But then I noticed something unusual. A shadow moved between the tall stalks. It glided silently through the field as if it were part of it, and I couldn't tear my eyes away from it. The shadow seemed to be approaching the barn, coming directly towards me. My mind told me it could only be an illusion, a play of light and shadow, but my heart beat faster, and the cold I had felt before crept back into me. I couldn't move, could only watch as the shadow came closer and closer. Then I heard the rustling again, but this time it was different. It was as if the cornfield itself was speaking to me, as if it wanted to warn me. I turned and ran back to the house without looking back. I knew something was out there, something watching me, and it wasn't just the cornfield. The next morning I tried to forget what had happened, to dismiss it as a figment of my imagination. But as I sat at breakfast, I heard footsteps on the gravel path outside the house. A man approached. His clothes were old and dirty, as if he had stepped directly from another time. He stopped at the fence and looked at me through the window. His eyes were cold and expressionless. I went out to greet him, asking if he needed help, but he didn't answer. Instead, he pointed a bony hand at the barn. "Do you hear it too?" he asked softly, his voice like the wind sweeping through the fields. I felt my throat tighten. How did he know about the whispering? He stepped closer to me, and a putrid smell wafted towards me. "It's hungry," he whispered. "It will get you if you let it." Then he turned and walked away as if he had never been there. I stood frozen, his words echoing in my head. I knew I couldn't ignore it, that I had to find out the truth. The next few days I spent contemplating the man's words. Who had he been? A madman, a hermit, or someone who knew about the barn? I only knew that I had to face the truth, even if I didn't know what to expect. One night when the whispering returned, I decided to follow it. I went into the barn and listened to the voices. They seemed to call me, to lure me deeper into the space. I followed them step by step until I stood before a trapdoor in the floor that I had never noticed before. I opened it carefully and a gush of cold air rushed towards me. A steep staircase led down into the darkness. The whispering grew louder, more urgent, as if it wanted to guide me. With trembling hands, I grabbed the flashlight and began the descent. I knew I was about to uncover a secret that would have been better left in the dark. Downstairs, I found myself in a narrow corridor that ran deep beneath the barn. The walls were damp and covered with strange symbols that glittered in the light of my flashlight. The whispering was now deafening, a choir of countless voices that seemed to come from the walls. With every step I took forward, I felt the air grow heavier, as if something was pressing against me, trying to force me to turn back. But I couldn't stop. The voices pulled me forward, and suddenly I stood before a door. It was made of heavy wood and looked as if it hadn't been opened for centuries. I remembered the stranger's words, his warning, "It will get you if you let it." For a moment I hesitated, my hand on the cold metal handle, then I slowly pressed it down and opened the door. Behind it lay a room shrouded in deep blackness, and from that darkness a figure came towards me. The figure had no solid form. It was a shadow, a blot of darkness that transformed and changed before my eyes. The whispering swelled, becoming a scream in my head that forced me to my knees. I couldn't look away, couldn't move. It felt as if I was trapped in a nightmare from which there was no awakening. The figure came closer, and I could feel the cold emanating from it. It enveloped me, and I felt my thoughts dissolving as if it was absorbing my memory, my existence. I tried to scream, but no sound came from my lips. I was trapped in the darkness, and the whispering became the only sound in my head. Then suddenly the figure released me and vanished into nothingness. The whispering fell silent, and I was left alone in the room. I don't know how long I knelt there, unable to move or think, but when I finally got up and left the room, I knew I was changed. Something had settled within me, something dark that I couldn't get rid of. After I made it out of the barn, I searched for answers in the following weeks. I went to the village library, spoke with the oldest residents, but no one wanted to talk about the farm's past. It was as if they all had an unspoken agreement to keep the truth hidden. Finally, I found clues in an old book. It spoke of a ritual practiced on the land many years ago, a sacrifice made to ensure a good harvest. The barn had been the site of this ritual, and the voices I had heard were those of the sacrificed. Their souls were bound to this place, and they were looking for a way to free themselves. I understood that the shadow I had seen was a manifestation of these souls, a construct of their suffering and despair. They were not evil, but lost, trapped in an endless cycle of pain, and I had disturbed them, had broken the balance. Now they were looking for a new victim to close the cycle. I knew I couldn't stay. The shadow haunted me, appeared in my dreams, lurked in every corner of the house. The whispering didn't stop, growing louder and more urgent, as if the souls were trying to force me to stay. But I was determined to leave this place behind and never return. On the day of my departure, I stood before the barn one last time. It looked as it always did, deserted and unassuming. And yet I knew it harbored a darkness that would never disappear. I heard the whispering one last time, a soft rustling that seemed to come from the walls, a farewell or a warning, I didn't know. As I got into the car and left the farm, I felt a strange emptiness within me. It was as if I had left a part of myself behind, a part that would be forever trapped in the darkness of the barn. I didn't look back, I just kept driving, further and further away from the shadows that haunted me. But deep inside I knew I would never truly get rid of them. When I inherited my great-uncle's mill, I knew little about its history. It stood in a secluded location, surrounded by dense forest, and a small pond lay quietly beside it. The place had something peaceful about it, but also something eerie. The mill had been abandoned for years, the windows were shattered, and the roof had collapsed in some places. I decided to stay there for a while to explore the mill and perhaps find out something about its past. The locals in the nearest village were reserved. When I asked them about the mill, they avoided the subject, changing the conversation as if they didn't want to know anything about it. That only made me more curious. When I first entered the old building, a oppressive silence enveloped me. The air was heavy and a musty smell rose into my nose. I switched on my flashlight and shone it into the darkness. Old tools and machines lay everywhere, rusty and decaying. But what struck me most was the complete absence of noise, as if the mill had sucked the life out of itself. In the first few days, nothing unusual happened. I explored the grounds, cut back the tall grass, and tidied up the mill. The pond next to the building looked like a still mirror, reflecting the sunlight and giving the place a deceptive idyll. I felt almost comfortable there, as if the mill and I were slowly getting used to each other. During the day, the place was peaceful. Light broke through the trees and danced on the water's surface. But as soon as the sun went down, the atmosphere changed. The silence became more oppressive, and an uncomfortable feeling crept up inside me, as if something was lurking in the darkness. I tried to ignore these feelings, telling myself it was just imagination. One evening, I sat at the edge of the pond, watching the fog slowly drift over the water. It was strangely calming to listen to the gentle rustling of the wind. But then I noticed something. The fog seemed to thicken, moving in a certain direction as if it was heading towards something. A shiver ran down my spine, and I went back into the house before darkness fully set in. The next day, I began to examine the pond more closely. Something about it bothered me, wouldn't leave me alone. The water was murky and dark, and although I stared deep into it, I couldn't see the bottom. It was as if the pond possessed a depth that made it a black abyss. I decided to take an old rowboat that lay beside the mill to go out on the water. With each stroke of the oar, I felt more uneasy, as if something was pulling me away from the shore. The silence surrounded me like a blanket, and the only sound was the soft lapping of the water against the sides of the boat. As I reached the middle of the pond, I paused and listened. Nothing, not even the chirping of a bird, could be heard. Then suddenly, I heard a faint crackling, as if something was under the surface of the water. I leaned over the edge of the boat to get a better look, and at that moment I saw it. A shadow moving beneath me, something large and dark swimming towards the bottom of the pond. My heart beat faster, and I couldn't tear my eyes away from the shadow. It moved slowly, almost sluggishly, as if it was watching me. I tore myself away and rowed back to shore as fast as I could. Sweat beaded on my forehead as I finally pulled the boat ashore and got out. The pond looked calm and harmless again, as if nothing had happened. In the following nights, I kept hearing noises from the direction of the pond, a splashing sound as if something was emerging from the water, and then a strange sucking sound that made my blood run cold. I couldn't sleep, lying awake and listening until the first rays of sun crept over the horizon. One night, I decided to see what was going on there. I took a flashlight and crept out to the pond. The silence was oppressive, and the fog lay like a heavy blanket over the water. I shone the light on the water's surface, but I couldn't see anything. But then all of a sudden I saw it again, the movement in the water, a dark shadow lurking beneath the surface. The moment I leaned over the water, I heard it, a scream so piercing and terrifying that I almost fell into the water in fright. It wasn't a human scream, but a soundless shriek that lodged itself in my head and took my breath away. I stumbled back, dropping the flashlight, which landed in the grass and only dimly illuminated the pond. I stared at the water, which was now still again, as if nothing had happened, but I knew there was something down there, something that shouldn't come up. The scream had frozen my blood, and a deep dread seized me. I had to get away from here, but I couldn't move. I was paralyzed by fear. Then, as I finally gathered myself to run back to the house, I saw it. A figure directly beneath the water's surface, looking at me. Its face was distorted as if by an invisible force, and its eyes stared at me, empty and full of pain. I screamed and ran back to the house, leaving everything behind. I barricaded myself in the house, closing all windows and doors as if that could hold back what I had seen. But the silence outside was the worst. No sound reached my ears, not even the gentle rustling of the wind. It was as if the world was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible. Suddenly I heard it, a song soft and melodic coming from outside. It wasn't human, more like a whisper in the wind, and yet I couldn't understand the words. They seemed to call me, to lure me. My mind screamed at me not to go outside, but my legs carried me to the door as if of their own accord. I opened it and stepped out into the darkness. The singing grew louder, seeming to envelop me and lead me to the pond. The fog lay heavy on the water and the figure was gone, but the singing didn't stop. It seemed to come from the depths of the pond. I couldn't resist. I walked closer, and as I looked over the edge of the water, I saw it again, the figure staring at me and singing. The next morning, I decided to return to the village. I had to talk to the people there. I had to know what was going on with the mill and the pond. When I arrived, I immediately noticed that people avoided me. They looked at me as if they knew exactly what I had experienced. I finally found an elderly woman who was willing to talk. Her eyes were filled with worry as she listened to my story. "You saw him, didn't you?" she asked softly, "the ghost of the pond." She told me that many years ago a man had drowned in the pond under mysterious circumstances. Since then, his spirit would lurk in the depths, restless and full of anger. The villagers had learned to avoid him, leaving the mill and the pond to themselves. They warned everyone not to go there, but I hadn't listened to them. Now I was the one who had woken him. "He won't stop," the woman said, "until he gets what he wants." But she couldn't tell me what that was. I returned to the mill, but it had lost its charm. Everywhere I felt his presence, in every shadow, in every whisper of the wind. The nights became unbearable, and the singing I had heard haunted me in my dreams. I knew I was no longer safe, that the spirit of the pond would come for me. One night I ventured out again. The pond lay still and dark before me. The fog hung heavy in the air. I called out to him, challenged him, wanted to know what he wanted from me. But it remained silent, and the figure that had so often haunted me was gone. I felt lost, no longer knowing what was real and what was not. I returned to the house, sat at the table, and tried to gather my thoughts, but then I heard it again, the soft singing coming from the pond. I went to the window, and at that moment I felt a coldness that penetrated the walls. He was no longer in the pond, he was in the house. The next few days I desperately sought a solution. I found documents hidden in a chest in the mill's floor. They spoke of a curse on the land, of a pact that had been broken. The man who had drowned was no ordinary man. He had tried to control the power of the water, but it had been his undoing. His spirit was bound to the pond, a guardian who was supposed to protect the water from intruders. But something had gone wrong. He had become a prisoner, and his anger at the living grew with each passing year. Now I was the intruder who had disturbed his realm. I knew I couldn't stay much longer. The nights became more unbearable, and I heard his singing more and more often, even in broad daylight. It was as if the pond was spreading its darkness over the mill, drawing it into its spell. I had to leave before it was too late, but I knew I couldn't just leave. It was one evening, just before I intended to leave the mill forever. I heard the singing again, louder and more urgent than ever before. It called me, lured me to the pond. I knew this was my last chance to find out the truth before I left this place behind forever. I went out, armed only with a flashlight and my will to resist him. The pond lay still and menacing before me. The fog thickened around me. I stepped closer, looked into the dark water, and called his name. Nothing happened. The silence was oppressive. But then, suddenly, the water broke. The figure rose from the pond, its body made of shadows and water. Its eyes stared at me, full of hatred and despair. The singing swelled, filling the air and penetrating my mind. I couldn't run, I was paralyzed. But then, in a last act of resistance, I screamed back, shouting that I would not yield. The spirit shrieked, a sound that tore through the air, and then it vanished before my eyes. The pond was calm again, but I knew it would never truly be gone. I had never believed in ghost stories, but the forest next to the old farmhouse I inherited awakened a strange feeling in me. When I first stepped onto the path that led deep into the forest, an oppressive silence immediately enveloped me. It was as if the forest had a life of its own, one that wanted nothing to do with me. The air was cool and the smell of damp earth was in my nose. The trees stood close together, their branches intertwined into an impenetrable roof of leaves. Hardly a ray of sunshine penetrated, and the ground was covered with a thick carpet of leaves. With every step I took, I felt myself being drawn deeper into the forest as if it wanted to swallow me. Suddenly I stopped. A sound broke the silence, the rustling of leaves, yet no wind stirred. It sounded as if someone was crossing my path, invisible and silent. I turned around, but there was nothing. Only the trees surrounding me. I swallowed hard and walked on, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't leave me. In the following days, I couldn't forget the sounds of the forest. They haunted me in my thoughts, a soft rustling that kept me awake at night. Every gust of wind, every crack of branches made me jump. It was as if the forest had a life of its own, one that didn't want to accept me. One evening, as I sat on the porch looking into the forest, I heard it again. The rustling was louder now, clearer, as if the forest itself was speaking to me. The leaves rustled, and I could have sworn I heard voices in them. They whispered my name over and over again in a monotonous, menacing tone. I stood up, took a few steps towards the forest, but the whispering immediately fell silent. The forest was still, as if holding its breath. I turned and went back into the house, but the voices followed me, echoing in my head. They wanted something from me. That was clear, but I didn't know what it was. At night, I had nightmares. In my dreams, I was back in the forest, surrounded by the huge old trees that loomed menacingly over me. Their branches seemed to reach out for me, wanting to hold me. Everywhere there were eyes staring at me from the darkness, eyes that reflected no light and yet followed my every move. One night, when I woke up covered in sweat, I had the feeling that something was in the room. I sat up, listening to the silence, but there was nothing but the dull pounding of my own heart. But then, as I turned my gaze to the window, I saw it, eyes staring at me from the darkness of the forest. They were large, glowing with an eerie luminescence that froze the blood in my veins. I jumped out of bed, ripped the curtain shut, but the eyes remained, fixated on me with a gaze that seemed to pierce through me. In a panic, I ran out of the room, closed the door behind me, and barricaded myself in the living room. But I knew I couldn't escape. The forest had me in its grip. The next morning, I decided to re-enter the forest. I had to know what was going on there, had to find out the truth. Armed with a flashlight and a knife, I set off. The forest lay still and gloomy before me, and with every step I went deeper, the silence became more oppressive. I followed a barely discernible path that wound through the undergrowth. It was as if the forest was leading me in a certain direction, guiding me. The trees seemed to close in, forming a kind of tunnel that pulled me into its depths. I tried to memorize the way, but everything looked the same, every tree, every bush. After a while, I realized I was lost. The forest seemed to have changed, as if it had conspired against me. I couldn't find my way back. I was trapped in a labyrinth of trees and shadows. The rustling grew louder again. The voices in my head more insistent. They wanted me to go on, to find something hidden deep within the forest. Suddenly, I stopped. A cool breeze brushed my face and I heard the whispering again, but this time it was different. It was clearer, more distinct, and it seemed to come directly from the wind. The voices were now understandable, and they whispered to me as if they wanted to tell me a secret. "We are here," they said, "always been here, you belong to us." A shiver ran down my spine, and I tried to ignore the voices, to concentrate on the path. But the forest wouldn't let me go. It urged me deeper into its darkness. The wind grew stronger and the whispering swelled to a crescendo that pained my ears. I felt like I was in a nightmare from which there was no awakening. The trees seemed to move, their branches like arms reaching for me. I closed my eyes, tried to ignore the whispering, but it penetrated my mind, filling my thoughts with images and words I didn't understand. The forest was speaking to me and I knew I couldn't escape. Amidst my panic, I suddenly heard footsteps behind me. I turned around and saw an old man slowly approaching me. He wore a worn jacket and had a face lined by years of working in nature. His eyes were gray and looked at me piercingly. "You shouldn't be here," he said in a rough voice. The forest doesn't take intruders. I stared at him, unable to say anything. I tried to warn you, he continued. The signs are everywhere. The forest has its own rules. I wanted to ask what he meant, but he just shook his head and pointed to the path I had come from. The forest has chosen you, he said softly. It has felt your soul, and now you are a part of it. Then he turned and disappeared among the trees as if he had never been there. I felt dazed, as if the ground beneath my feet was swaying. What had he meant? Had I really become part of the forest? And if so, what did that mean for me? When I finally found my way back to the house, I felt exhausted. The old man's words echoed in my head, and I couldn't stop thinking about them. That night, I dreamed of the forest again, but it wasn't a dream like I had experienced before. It felt real, as if I was actually there. I stood in a clearing, surrounded by the tall, dark trees. The moon shone through the leaves, casting a ghostly light on everything. Everywhere were the eyes staring at me, and the whispering was now a chorus calling my name. I knew I should run, but my legs wouldn't move. Suddenly, a figure stepped out from among the trees. It was the old forester, but he looked different. His eyes were now black, empty, and a cruel smile lay on his twisted lips. "You are one of us," he said, his voice an echo in the darkness. "You belong to the forest." I wanted to scream, but no sound came from my lips. Then I woke up, drenched in sweat and trembling. The dream wouldn't leave me. I knew it was more than just a nightmare, that the forest was truly calling me to itself. In the following days, I felt a strange connection to the trees, to the rustling of the wind in the leaves. It was as if I could feel their heartbeat, their breath. The forest was alive, and it had cast its spell over me, but I was not ready to simply surrender. I began to investigate, looking for stories about the forest, about the old forester, but the villagers avoided me, didn't want to talk about him. It was as if they all followed an unspoken rule not to mention the forest. In an old village chronicle, I finally found clues. It said that the forester had died many years ago, disappearing mysteriously in the forest. Since then, rumors circulated that his spirit lived in the trees, that he hunted the souls of those who entered the forest, and now he had chosen me. I knew I had to fight, but how do you fight a living forest? I knew I had to go back to confront the forest and the forester. With a pounding heart and trembling hands, I packed my things and set off. The forest lay dark and still before me, yet I felt its presence, felt it waiting for me. There was no turning back. I entered the path that led me back into the depths of the forest. The voices immediately began, whispering my name, and the rustling of the leaves became a roar in my ears. The forest was alive. All around me the shadows came to life, and I knew I wasn't alone. The forester was there, somewhere in the darkness. Suddenly I stopped. Before me stood the figure of the forester, his eyes glowing with an unnatural light. "You have no choice," he said softly. "You are a part of us." I felt the forest close in around me, the trees moving closer. And I knew this was the moment of decision. The circle was closing, and I had to find a way to break it. In a last desperate attempt, I uttered a prayer, calling for help, for a sign. The forester laughed, a cold, horrifying laugh that echoed through the darkness. But then something unexpected happened. A light appeared, a bright, dazzling ray that illuminated the forester and the forest around me. The light seemed to come from the trees themselves, as if they were protecting me, as if they were showing me a way out. The forester shrieked, an angry, pain-filled scream, and dissolved into thin air before my eyes. The whispering fell silent, and peace returned, but it was a different silence, one no longer filled with menace. I knew I had escaped. The forest released me, gave me my freedom back. But I also knew that the forester hadn't truly disappeared, that he was lurking somewhere in the depths of the forest, searching for a new soul. It was one of those oppressively hot summer days when the air shimmered and not a breath of wind stirred. I had retreated to my family's old farmhouse, nestled deep in the fields, far from the hustle and bustle of the city. The fields stretched endlessly, and the wind occasionally carried the scent of fresh hay. I sat on the porch, gazing out over the land, watching the waves in the cornfield that the wind caused. But suddenly the wind stopped, and an eerie silence fell over the land. It was as if someone had turned off the sound, and even the birds were silent. A shiver ran down my spine despite the heat of the day. I stood up and walked a few steps towards the fields. They seemed different than before, as if they had come alive in an uncanny way. The stalks swayed gently back and forth, although no wind could be felt. It was as if they were whispering to each other, a soft rustling that was barely audible and yet captivated my attention. In the following days, I noticed that the wind had changed. It no longer blew as freely and unconcernedly as before. Instead, it seemed to carry a kind of melody, a whispering, ominous melody that seemed to come from the fields. Every time I came near the fields, I heard it, a soft, barely perceptible whisper that settled in my mind. I tried to pay no attention to it, telling myself it was just the heat playing tricks on me. But the whispering grew louder, more urgent. It sounded like a voice calling me, whispering my name. I couldn't say where it came from, only that it was always there, hidden deep within the cornfield. One evening, as the sun was already setting behind the hills and the sky was bathed in a blood-red light, I couldn't take it anymore. I went out into the fields, searching for the source of this eerie whispering. With every step I took, the voice grew louder, seeming to draw me deeper into the field. The wind picked up, carrying the whispering around me until I stopped and listened. The whispering led me to a part of the field I had avoided until now. It was a small clearing, surrounded by tall cornstalks that closed around it like a wall. The air here was heavy and cold, even though the night was still warm. I stopped, unsure whether to continue, but the voice left me no choice. When I entered the clearing, I immediately noticed that the ground was different. The grass was withered and dry, as if no life could exist in this place. An eerie feeling came over me, and I felt that this was the origin of the whispering. It was as if the ground itself was speaking to me, as if it harbored a secret that no one should know. I knelt down and placed a hand on the ground. It felt cold and hard, and at that moment a shiver ran through me. The whispering swelled to a crescendo, filling my head with words I didn't understand. It was as if the ground was calling me to itself, wanting to pull me into its dark depths. I pulled my hand back, stood up, and ran out of the clearing as fast as I could. After returning from the clearing, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking in the fields. It was an inexplicable feeling of dread that wouldn't leave me even in the house. Every night I lay awake, listening to the wind howling around the house and bringing the whispering with it. Days passed, but the feeling remained. It was as if the fields were watching me, as if they were waiting for something. I avoided going near the clearing, but the whispering was always there in my head, in my thoughts. It wouldn't let go, gnawing at my mind until I no longer knew what was real and what was not. One night, as I stood by the window looking out at the fields, I saw something, a movement, a shadow moving through the corn. I squinted my eyes, trying to see more clearly, but there was nothing there but the fields swaying in the wind and the whispering that seemed to call me louder and louder. On a particularly stormy night, I heard the woman's voice for the first time. It was late, and I was lying in bed when the wind suddenly picked up. The whispering was louder than ever before, and in the midst of that cacophony, I heard her, a clear, melodic voice that seemed to come from the depths of the field. She sang a song that sounded strangely familiar to me. I sat up, listening intently, but the words remained incomprehensible. It was as if she was singing in a language I didn't know, and yet I knew she was referring to me. Her song was sad and yet wonderfully beautiful, and I felt drawn to her involuntarily. Against my will, I got up and went to the window. Outside, it was dark, and the wind howled around the house. The fields seemed to be moving, as if dancing to the rhythm of the song. I couldn't see her, but I knew she was there, somewhere in the field, and that she was waiting for me. I opened the window and listened, but the singing immediately stopped. Only the wind remained, carrying the whispering of the fields with it. The next morning, I decided to go look for her. I knew it was crazy, that I was imagining everything, and yet I couldn't help myself. I had to know who she was and why she was calling me, so I went out into the fields. The morning mist still lay over the land, and the whispering accompanied my every step. I followed the path that led me to the clearing, but this time it was different. The wind was still, and the fields lay motionless under the rising sun. It was as if they were waiting for me, as if they knew I would come. With every step, the feeling of the uncanny grew stronger, and I felt that I was about to discover something not meant for human eyes. When I reached the clearing, I stopped. She was there in the middle of the field, a woman dressed in a long white dress that fluttered in the wind. Her face was pale and her eyes were fixed on me. She said nothing, but her gaze spoke volumes. I knew it was she who had called me and that she wanted to show me something. The woman led me to an abandoned farmhouse at the edge of the field that I had never noticed before. It was old and dilapidated, the windows broken and the roof caved in. Nevertheless, it had something eerie about it, as if it was still inhabited by the ghosts of the past. The woman stopped in front of the door and looked at me as if urging me to enter. I hesitated, but her eyes held my gaze. I knew I had no choice, so I went inside. The floorboards creaked under my feet and a musty smell wafted towards me. The walls were covered with mold and the few pieces of furniture that remained were decaying and rotten. But in the middle of the room stood something that caught my attention. It was an old book lying on a table. The cover was made of leather and decorated with strange symbols that I didn't recognize. I went closer and opened it. The pages were yellowed and brittle, but the text was still legible. It was an old manuscript that told of a woman who had lived on this farm long ago, a woman who harbored a dark secret. I took the book back to the house and spent the rest of the day reading it. It was the story of the woman I had seen in the field. And she had lived here many years ago, alone and isolated, and the villagers avoided her. It was rumored that she was a witch who spoke to the spirits of the fields and made sacrifices to them to appease them. One day she disappeared without a trace, and no one knew what had become of her. But since then, the book said, a voice could be heard singing in the fields. It was her voice that drove the villagers mad until they avoided the field and left the farmhouse to decay. They said she was still there, a part of the field, a spirit that never found peace. I knew I had seen her, that she had called me to her, but why? What did she want from me? The book gave no answers, only vague allusions and stories that raised more questions than they answered. But one thing was clear, she was still there in the fields and she wanted me to free her. In the next few days, I tried to find out more about the woman's story. I talked to the older villagers, but they were silent, unwilling to talk about it. Some said she had been a witch, others that she had gone mad, but no one knew exactly what had happened to her. I returned to the fields looking for clues, for anything that could help me. The whispering was back, louder and more insistent, and it always led me back to the clearing. I knew something had to be buried there, something that held the woman back, that bound her to this place. One evening, when the wind was particularly strong and the whispering swelled to an ominous singing, I began to dig. With my hands, I scraped away the earth until I hit something hard. It was a box, old and rotten, and I hesitated for a moment before opening it. Inside lay an old amulet, surrounded by earth and bones. A feeling of coldness ran through me as I touched it. As I lifted the amulet from the box, a sharp pain shot through me. The whispering around me fell silent, and an eerie stillness settled over the fields. I felt something dark and powerful surrounding me, as if the woman's spirit was speaking to me through the amulet. She had called me to free her, but at what price? I knew I had to destroy it, that it was the only way to free her and myself from the curse. With trembling hands, I threw the amulet to the ground and shattered it with a stone. A piercing scream filled the air, and a cold gust of wind swept across the fields. It was as if the earth itself cried out, and I fell to my knees, my hands clasped over my face. Then it was over. The silence returned, and the fields lay peacefully under the night sky. The whispering was gone, and I knew that the woman had finally found peace. I stood up, gazing out over the land. The fields looked the same as always, but I knew they had changed. They had lost their voice, and I had found my peace. But the price had been high, and I knew I would never set foot in that place again. The farm I inherited lay far from civilization, surrounded by dense forests and endless fields. When I arrived there, I immediately felt a strange heaviness in the air. The buildings were old and dilapidated, and it seemed as if no one had been there for years. Yet something about this place drew me in, an undefined curiosity that I couldn't ignore. Summer was in full swing and the fields were in full bloom. Everywhere the golden ears swayed in the wind as if whispering a silent greeting. I spent the first day exploring the old house and the surrounding barns. Everything was in better condition than I had expected, and I decided to stay there for a while and take care of the fields, but already on the first night I felt that something was wrong. I woke up without knowing why and lay still in bed for a while, listening to the darkness. It was a soft rustle, a whisper that drifted through the house, as if the wind was finding its way through the cracks. It was as if the walls of the house themselves were speaking to me, an ominous whisper that reminded me of the ghosts of old times. The following nights were accompanied by a feeling of unease. Every night I woke up several times, feeling eyes on me, watching me from the darkness. I had the impression that the house was alive, that it didn't want me, but every time I got up and crept through the corridors, there was nothing. Only the darkness and the soft whispering of the wind. One night when I woke up again, I heard a strange noise from outside. It sounded like a dull knocking, as if someone or something was hitting the walls of the house. I went to the window and looked out but couldn't see anything. The fields lay still under the moonlight, but I had the uncanny feeling that something was lurking in them. I lay back in bed, but sleep would not come. Instead, I lay there, eyes wide, listening to the knocking that seemed to come from somewhere. It was irregular, sometimes louder, sometimes softer, as if it was moving through the house. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore and went downstairs to see what was going on. When dawn broke, I had no explanation for what I had heard during the night. The knocking had disappeared and the house lay still and peaceful as if nothing had happened. I felt exhausted, as if I had been awake all night, and decided to get some fresh air. I went out into the fields, which shimmered like a golden sea in the first light of day. The air was cool and a light mist hung over the ears of corn. I walked a little way in, letting my hand run over the stalks, and suddenly felt a strange coldness creeping up my arm. It was as if the fields themselves were reaching out to me, as if they wanted to hold me. I stopped and looked around. Everything was silent, but there was a feeling inside me, a deep, gnawing feeling of fear. And then I saw it, a figure far away on the horizon, a black silhouette that didn't move. It just stood there, motionless, and seemed to be watching me. I rubbed my eyes, and when I looked again, it was gone, but the feeling of coldness remained. In the following days, I began to notice strange changes on the farm. The animals I had found on the property behaved increasingly strangely. The chickens clucked nervously and constantly sought shelter in their coop, as if driven by an invisible threat. The sheep bleated restlessly and huddled together in a corner of the enclosure. I tried to calm them, but it seemed as if they saw something that remained hidden from me. Their eyes widened when they looked in the direction of the fields, and I could see the terror in their gaze. It was as if they knew something was out there, something that frightened them, but no matter how hard I looked, I found nothing unusual. One night, I heard the knocking again, this time louder and more insistent. It came directly from the barn where the animals were housed. I took a lamp and went out. When I opened the door, the knocking stopped, and the animals burst into a wild outcry. They were in a panic, running back and forth in their stalls, and I felt that something was in the barn, something that didn't want to be seen. That night I could hardly sleep. The feeling that something was wrong on the farm grew stronger and stronger. I knew I had overlooked something, something that lay hidden and was waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. The next morning I went searching. I combed through the house and the barns, looking for clues that could explain what was going on here. In one of the old barns, I finally found a trapdoor in the floor, hidden under a thick layer of straw. It was heavy and rusty, as if it hadn't been opened for years. With great effort, I managed to pry it open, and underneath, a staircase leading into darkness appeared. A musty smell wafted towards me, and I hesitated for a moment before descending. The cellar was cold and damp, and the light of my lamp illuminated only a small part of the room. But in the darkness, I could make out outlines, shapes that looked like statues or figures. As I approached, I saw that they were scarecrows, dozens of them arranged as if in a macabre theater. They wore old, torn clothes, and their heads were made of sacks with crude faces painted on them. It was as if they were staring at me, and I felt a cold hand clasp around my heart. I didn't know what these scarecrows were doing down there, but their sight sent a shiver down my spine. It was as if they were waiting for someone to find them, as if they served a purpose I couldn't comprehend. I felt that the place was charged with a dark energy, and I could feel the eyes of the scarecrows on me as I turned and fled from the cellar as quickly as possible. The following night, I could barely rest. Again and again I heard the knocking, which now seemed to come from everywhere. It penetrated the walls of the house, through the floors, as if it was surrounding me. I knew there was no escape, that I had to face the truth, so I went out into the darkness, lamp in hand, and followed the sound. It led me to the fields, to a place I had never entered before. There in the middle of the corn I found a circle of stones, in the center of which stood a wooden pole. Ribbons and feathers were attached to it, and the ground was painted with strange symbols. I realized that this was a place of ritual, a sacrificial site meant to appease the spirits of the fields, and I knew that the ritual was not complete. I stood in the middle of the circle and felt the air around me change. It was as if a veil between the worlds lifted, as if something was rising from the depths of the earth. The knocking ceased, and an eerie silence fell over the fields. I felt that I was not alone, that the spirits of the harvest were around me, invisible and yet omnipresent. Suddenly I saw them. The scarecrows I had seen in the cellar now stood in the fields, their empty eyes fixed on me. It was as if they had come to life, as if they were waiting for me. Their sight filled me with a deep dread, and I knew I had become part of an ancient, dark game that I didn't understand. The air around me began to shimmer, and I heard a soft, ominous murmur coming from the fields. It was as if the earth itself was speaking to me, as if it was revealing a secret that I didn't want to hear. I felt the world around me change, as if the boundaries between life and death blurred, and I knew I had made a mistake entering this place. In the darkness of the night I saw them, shadows moving between the rows of scarecrows, spirits living in the earth and the corn. They came closer, circling me as if testing me. I could feel their eyes on me, cold and piercing, and I knew they were watching me, waiting for something. I wanted to run, but my legs were paralyzed. The air was heavy and cold, and the whispering around me grew louder. It was as if the spirits were talking to each other, as if they were making a decision. I couldn't see their faces, only their eyes staring at me from the darkness, full of anger and sorrow. Suddenly, I felt a touch on my shoulder. I turned and saw a figure dressed in old, torn clothes, with a face made of earth and straw. It looked at me, and I realized that it wasn't truly alive, that it was only a shadow, an echo of the past. Yet its grip was firm, and I felt the cold penetrate my body. It was here to take me. At that moment, I understood what had happened. The spirits were here because they demanded a pact, a deal that had been passed down in this family for generations. The fields demanded their tribute, a sacrifice that had to be made to secure the harvest. The scarecrows were the guardians of this pact, the bond between the living and the dead. I knew I had to find a way out, that I somehow had to negotiate with them. With a trembling voice I began to speak, begging for mercy, for understanding, but the spirits remained silent, their eyes fixed on me, and I felt they would not negotiate. They demanded their price, and I knew I had to pay it. In my desperation, I held up the amulet I had found in the cellar. It was the only thing I could think of, the only thing that might appease them. The spirits hesitated, and I saw them staring at the amulet. It was as if they recognized it, as if it had meaning for them. For a moment, it seemed as if the world stood still, as if the pact was being renegotiated. The moment lasted an eternity, but finally the spirits retreated. The amulet in my hand glowed with a cold blue light, and I felt the darkness around me fade. The scarecrows returned to their places, stiff and motionless, and the spirits vanished into the earth from which they had come. The pact was sealed, but I knew the price had been high. I stood there for a while longer, trembling and exhausted, and let the amulet fall to the ground. It broke into 1,000 pieces, and I knew that with it I had severed the last thread to the world of spirits. The fields lay still again under the night sky, and the whispering had ceased, but I knew it hadn't disappeared forever, that it would return one day to claim its price. The next morning, I packed my things and left the farm. I knew I would never return, that this place was not meant for the living. But as I left the fields behind, I knew they would never truly let me go. They had become a part of me, and the whispering of the harvest spirits would accompany me forever, a constant companion in the shadows of my life. My grandparents' farm had always been a place full of childhood memories for me. When I visited it again after many years to sell it, I didn't know that all that would change. The sight of the old farm, which lay at the edge of a deep forest, evoked a strange feeling in me. Something had changed, and it was as if the place itself felt it. The buildings were old and dilapidated, the windows of the house broken, and the wood of the hayloft worn. Yet something about this place drew me in, an undefined curiosity that I couldn't ignore. Perhaps it was the scent of hay or the memory of the summers I had spent here. I decided to stay for a few days to say goodbye and prepare the house for sale. On the first night, I felt that something was wrong. There was a strange silence over the farm, as if the place was holding its breath. I lay awake listening, but I couldn't hear anything except the occasional creaking of the wood. But deep inside, I knew that this silence was not normal, that it portended something ominous. The next day, I began to rummage through the house to see what I should keep and what I should throw away. In a corner of the attic, I found an old box locked with a heavy padlock. The key was nowhere to be found, so I broke the lock with a hammer. Inside the box were yellowed papers, letters, and a diary that had belonged to my grandmother. I leafed through it, curious to learn more about the history of the farm and my family. But the more I read, the more a feeling of unease grew within me. The entries spoke of strange events, of voices in the night, and of a shadow living in the hayloft. My grandmother had written about waking up at night and feeling watched. She wrote of a shadow that moved through the farm, that dwelled in the hayloft, and that wandered through the house at night. They were confusing, disconnected words that made my blood run cold. I put the diary aside, but the words haunted me in my thoughts. On the second night, I couldn't sleep. My grandmother's words kept replaying in my mind, and the more I thought about them, the more restless I became. Around midnight, I heard it for the first time, a soft creaking, as if someone was creeping across the floorboards of the house. I sat up and listened, but everything was quiet. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was just the old wood working. But the creaking continued, growing louder, as if something was moving towards me. I got up and took a flashlight, ready to get to the bottom of the sound, but when I opened the door, there was nothing. The hallway lay dark and still before me, as if mocking me. I crept through the house, flashlight held tightly in my hand, searching for the source of the sound, but everything was quiet and I began to doubt my sanity. But when I passed the door to the hayloft, I stopped. There it was again. The creaking, and this time it clearly came from inside. I hesitated for a moment before opening the door and looking inside. The hayloft was in darkness, and the smell of old hay wafted towards me. I shone the flashlight into the corners, searching for the source of the sound, but I couldn't detect anything unusual. The room seemed empty, and yet I had the feeling that something was there, something I couldn't see. Suddenly I saw it, a shadow that moved at lightning speed through the hayloft. It was hidden from the light. It was only a brief moment, a fleeting glance, but it was enough to make my heart beat faster. I held my breath, listening to the darkness, but there was nothing left. The hayloft lay still and peaceful, as if it wanted to tell me that I had only imagined everything. I slowly walked backward, my gaze still fixed on the spot where I had seen the shadow, but nothing stirred. And finally, I turned and went back to the house. But the feeling of threat remained, and I knew I had seen something that didn't belong in this world. The shadow in the hayloft was real, and it was watching me. The next day, I found another book in the box in the attic. It was not a diary, but rather a book filled with drawings and symbols that were foreign to me. Between the pages was an old, yellowed slip of paper with a warning: "Do not open the gate." I didn't understand what that meant, but I felt it had something to do with the shadow in the hayloft. The book was covered with strange characters and symbols that looked like some kind of ritual or spell. It was frightening and fascinating at the same time. I carefully leafed through the pages and came across a passage that sent shivers down my spine. It spoke of a being that lived in the shadows of a gate that should never be opened. I couldn't stop thinking about it. What was this gate? And what did it have to do with the hayloft? I felt like I was on the verge of uncovering a secret that would have been better left hidden, but the urge to find out the truth was too strong. I knew I had to go back to the hayloft to find the answers I was looking for. The following night I was again awakened by the creaking. It was louder than before, more insistent, as if it was right next to my bed. I jumped up, grabbed the flashlight, and ran through the house. But the sound led me directly to the hayloft. There I stood, my hand on the doorknob, unsure whether to open it. I thought of the warning in the book of the gate that should never be opened, but the urge to know what was inside prevailed. I opened the door and entered the hayloft. The creaking stopped and an eerie silence settled over the room. I shone the flashlight into the corners, but there was nothing. Suddenly, I felt a coldness behind me. I turned around. And there he was, the shadow standing in the corner, staring at me. He was not a solid form, but rather a silhouette, a figure that seemed to form itself from the darkness itself. I felt an icy hand grasp my heart, and I knew I had made a mistake. I had opened the gate, and the shadow was here now. After seeing the shadow, I couldn't sleep peacefully anymore. Every night I woke up, feeling that he was with me, that he was watching me. I knew I had to do something to get rid of him, but I didn't know how. I started reading my grandmother's book again, looking for clues, for a way to close the gate again. Days passed, and I felt the shadow growing stronger and stronger. He was no longer just in the hayloft, but everywhere, in the corners of the house, in the cracks of the walls, in the mirrors, in the windows. I saw him in every shadow, in every dark spot. He had become a part of this place, a part of me. I felt trapped, as if I was under his spell, unable to escape. I knew I couldn't stay much longer, that I had to leave the farm, but I couldn't just leave it behind, not without knowing what the shadow really was. I had to find out the truth, had to understand what my grandmother had experienced and what she was trying to tell me. But time was running out and the shadow was getting closer and closer. On a cold, stormy night, I decided to put an end to the shadow. Armed with a flashlight and my grandmother's book, I went to the hayloft. The wind howled around the building and the door creaked as I opened it. The room lay in darkness and I immediately felt that something was different. It was as if the hayloft was waiting for me. I shone the flashlight into the darkness and saw it. The silhouette stood in the middle of the room, motionless, as if waiting for me. I trembled, but I knew I couldn't back down now. With trembling hands, I opened the book and began to read the words aloud, words that sounded like a spell, like an incantation. The shadow stirred, moved towards me, but I continued. The book in my hand began to tremble as if it was coming to life, and the words came faster, grew louder. Suddenly the room was filled with a dazzling light, and the shadow screamed, a sound that made my ears ring. I closed my eyes, but I felt him swirling around me, dissolving and disappearing. When I opened my eyes, the hayloft lay still and empty before me. The shadow was gone, and an uncanny calm had settled over the room. I felt weak, as if a part of me had left with the shadow, but I knew it wasn't over yet. I had driven him away, but I didn't know where. In the following days, I tried to recover, but the darkness wouldn't let me go. I felt that the shadow was still there, waiting for its chance to return. He was in the corners of the house. In the cracks of the walls, he had become a part of me, and I knew I would never truly get rid of him. I looked for a way out, for a way to banish him permanently, but my grandmother's book was burned and the words I had spoken were forgotten. I knew I had made a mistake, that I had opened the gate that should never have been opened, and now the shadow was free and he would never leave me alone. I knew I had to leave the farm. I packed my things and prepared to leave this place behind forever. But as I closed the door and looked at the hayloft one last time, I felt a strange calm within me. The shadow was no longer there, he was gone, and I didn't know where. I got into my car and drove down the long, deserted road, away from the farm, away from the memories. But deep inside, I knew it wasn't over. The shadow had become a part of me, a dark companion that followed my every step. I saw him in every mirror, in every shadow on the roadside. I knew I had opened the gate that should never have been opened, and that the shadow was now free to wander, to seek others who would dare to challenge him. And I knew that one day he would return, perhaps not to me, but to someone, and then the shadow in the hayloft would awaken again.